the University of Sheffield in the UK. And he's going to be presenting on work that he's recently completed that solicited the views of multiple stakeholders around who should value child and adolescent health. We'll follow the usual format. So Philip will be presenting for around 40 minutes, and we should have time for about 15 to 20 minutes of discussion at the end. So over to you, Philip. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stavros. Very happy to be here today and to present at this meeting. So, as Stavros says, today I'm going to talk about some work, a series of work really, that we've conducted at Sheffield that's looked into this problem of who should value child and adolescent health. And this is work that's been funded by the Euroqual Group and also by the NIHR, so National Institute for Health Research in the UK, under one of our strategic initiatives that we have at Sheffield. So what I'm going to talk about today really is I'm going to look into this problem and what we're addressing in the sense of whose opinion matters when we conduct valuation studies and elicit preferences describing child health states. I'm going to look into some of the rationale informing the approach we've taken, which is essentially to define and shed some light on some of the normative decisions, like who should value health, that we are interested in when it comes to child health states. I'm going to talk through three what are essentially complementary studies which have used different methods, but all asking the same sorts of questions in slightly different ways and with slightly different populations. And once I've talked through briefly all of those three studies, I'm going to try and triangulate what is common about all of those. So where the evidence is consistent across all three studies, I'm going to try and draw that out. And also, I want to reflect a little bit on some of the unresolved issues that we currently have. Arising from this research. So we don't have that answer for everything. There's lots of grey areas still in this space that we need to think about. And then I'll conclude, and then as Stavros says, there'll be plenty of time for us to discuss as a group some of these issues. So let's start with the problem. So this is what we are trying to address through our research. So when we elicit preferences for certain health states and derive value sets to inform utility scores for use in cost effectiveness analysis, we need to make certain methodological decisions. And a lot of these can be normative. So what we mean by that is they're value judgments. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's more about what we think should be done in this particular situation as a group of invested stakeholders. And this issue for adults, so when we're listing preferences for adult health states, there's a sort of normative position that we ask, as you can see by this illustration here, we ask adults themselves to value the health states, thinking about themselves. So in the UK, for example, we get them to imagine hypothetical health states, and then we get them to complete a standardized measure of value in health. It might be a TTO or a DCE or some sort of combined assessment. And we get them to think about how good or bad living in different health states are for themselves. And that tends to be the adopted position that we do when we're valuing adult health. So things become a bit more unclear when we move to value child health states, because there isn't to date a formalized or established normative position for who should value those health states. And this decision matters because we know from evidence that, for example, if adults are to value the relative importance of child health states, we're likely to get a different set of responses, different results than if we let adolescents themselves, for example, value the health states. And this has an impact later down the line because we can imagine that different estimates of utilities can, at the margins, affect different reimbursement decisions for child health technologies. So this is why we're kind of interested in this as a normative and methodological decision problem. So the two key issues that I'll be focusing on today are essentially who should value child health. So do we want, for example, as on the left, children themselves to complete these tasks and to give us an idea of their relative preferences for living in different health states? Or do we want a group of adults, as in on the right, for example, to value the health states? So that's one key decision to make. And the second one, which is related, is who should people be thinking about when they're valuing these health states. So if they're valuing hypothetical health states, we typically ask them to, or implicitly ask them to take a particular frame of reference. So for example, that might be to think about themselves living in the health states, how good or bad, or relatively good or bad they think the health states would be for themselves. Or we might ask them to think about another person. And typically, because we're dealing with child health states, that is inevitably going to be a child of some form. But then there are other questions as well. So, for example, if we ask them to think about a child, what age do we want to think about? And all these nuances and little additional questions come out when we think about these main issues of who should value and who should be imagined. And I just wanted to reflect a bit about the rationale for the approach we've taken in some of these studies. So that the basic idea is that you can have arguments on either side of these normative positions. So you could have a set of arguments that you can develop for why we should have children that value in the health states, child health states, and equally you can come up with a set of arguments for why we should have adults value in the health states. And as I said, because these decisions, these methodological decisions, are considered normative, they are essentially value judgments on what ought to be done. They're not necessarily a right. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer here. So it's more what collectively, as a group of health economists and other stakeholders, we think should be done. And then comes the question of who should decide. So who should decide what should be done in this space? And the key thing is that there's multiple stakeholders in the valuation process, and indeed the resultant health technology assessment process has multiple people who are involved in it or have a stake in it. So that includes patients themselves, it includes health economists who may be involved in the research or the modelling. It also includes policymakers who ultimately set the parameters for health technology assessment and reimbursement decisions. So the rationale behind some of these studies is that there's benefit in essentially identifying what is common or where there are areas of consensus, both within groups of stakeholders, so within, for example, members of the public or patients or experts, but also across them as well. And as well as identifying consensus, it also lets us know what we do know and where there's areas of that where what we don't know essentially, and we need further research or debate to develop our understanding and consensus in those areas. So that's the rationale behind the set of studies that I'm going to show to you now. So there's three complementary studies I'm going to talk to. The studies have all been completed now, so they've been conducted over the past couple of years, essentially successively. The first was a qualitative study that we did, which I'm going to talk through next. That's with members of the UK adult public. That's published now, so as the link on the slide shows, in Social Science and Medicine. So that's open access and accessible. The second study was a Delphi study, so that's a specialised survey type of study with a panel of experts. So there the population was health economists, people working in industry and policy experts who have a stake in valuing child health, and that's published as well in Social Science and Medicine and available. And then the latest work, which is more emerging, it was a dual country survey of members of the public's views on who they think should value child health in the UK and Sweden. And importantly, with that study, we included the views of older adolescents themselves, so aged 15 to 17, which is something that we and others haven't done before. So I'm going to start with study one, which is the qualitative study, and this is where we started really on this journey of amassing evidence of what the public think about this issue. We chose to do focus groups for this exercise, and although I said UK, it was largely with an English sample, so they all were residing in England. And one of the key things we did in this research, which is true also for especially for studies 1 and 3, when we're working with members of the public who may not be informed about evaluation full stop, let alone the issues that arise when you're evaluating child health, is that we took a lot of time trying to design bespoke informational materials that would help to inform them prior to the research taking place. So in this case, we used what's known as public and patient involvement and engagement collaborators. So people that we work with on a collaborative level to help us design, essentially, it was a video, an informed video that would explain as much as possible to the layperson the issues that are involved in valuation and why we're specifically concerned with these two sort of normative issues in valuing child health. So we took some time doing that, making sure it all made sense and it wasn't too leading, and it included all the key information that we thought people would need to know to have a sort of informed view on this issue. And then we recruited essentially from people from the UK, from England, using a market research agency for a breadth of age, biological sex, and whether they had responsibility or not for children. So how the focus groups worked essentially is that you'd have this informational phase, which was a bit more prolonged than you might have in other qualitative research because of the potential complexity of the issue. So that lasted maybe 20 to 30 minutes. And then you'd have an up to an hour discussion afterwards, talking through some of these issues for views about who those members of the general public thought should value child health and what perspective they thought they should take. We also explored various arguments for their reasoning. So we invited them to essentially come up with their own bespoke arguments, but we'd also prompt for their views if they didn't come up with any in particular, or if there were certain arguments that we were aware of in the literature that they hadn't discussed yet. We looked at their understanding of the topic as well, in terms of just self-reported, how difficult was it to understand, and we analysed the data essentially using framework analysis, which is a structured approach to thematic analysis in qualitative research. So our sample, we essentially conducted 5 focus groups, which is typical size for this type of research, and ended up with 32 people in total. There was about 50% were women. The mean age was around sort of 40, 41 years, so essentially a middle-aged sort of sample on average. We did have representation from minority ethnic communities, which was quite good. So we aimed to ensure that our sample wasn't just, for example, white British people, which we managed to achieve. A relatively well-educated group. Another key thing was that we did have spread across England. So we did, as you might imagine, have quite a concentration within London. So half of our sample was based within London, but for the other 50%, we essentially had at least one person in all the different regions of England. And we had that 50-50 split about whether they were responsible for a child aged under 18 or not. So there was a bit of heterogeneity and spread in terms of key characteristics within the sample. So this is what essentially we ended up with, the map that's on screen now, from our qualitative analysis. And there's quite a lot going on here in terms of colour. You can see that the bigger circles are kind of top level categories or themes, based on the 2 normative questions into who should be asked or who should people think about in orange and grey. And then we also coded a certain amount of participant understanding as well. And then as the circles get smaller, we have sort of our themes grouped within each of those categories. So it might be a set of quotes or evidence suggesting there was support for asking young people, or there might be a support for thinking about themselves when they're being asked these questions. And then beneath that, with the smallest circles, we've got the different arguments that were levied for each of these positions. And we don't need to worry too much about the color. This is one of those figures that I look at now and think maybe I've made it too complicated for its own good in terms of disseminating information. But the green coloring means that there was a supportive argument, or there were views shared for that argument that were supportive for the theme, and the red coloring is that it was views shared that were against that theme, and the thickness of the arrows are essentially demonstrating how much was coded for that particular argument or theme. So this is just to give you an overview of essentially what our framework looked like when we finished the analysis, but I'm going to go through some key results now to simplify things. So we've split the results essentially into who should value and with what perspective, or who should be imagined. And the key thing was that essentially there was an intuitive sense among participants, even when they're informed about the issues in valuation, that children should be involved in some form. And most of the arguments and support for this was caveated by it should be proportionate to their age. So there was a recognition that given can be a complex task, that participants wanted to see greater involvement for children and adolescents at the older age range rather than younger children, where they think there could be particular difficulty in maybe understanding or giving their views. And the argument that came out, which was replicated, as you'll see in other studies, is the strongest one is the right to have a say argument. So this goes back to essentially one of the UN's rights of the child publication about children having a right to have a say in issues that affect them. That was one of the strongest arguments that was given for why, fundamentally, in principle, these participants believe that children should be involved in valuation proportionate to their age. What was kind of interesting and something that we can reflect on later is that participants weren't solely of the view that it should just be children, so we should just have children and adolescents valuing child health states. They also saw a critical role for adults in the process, and there's a few reasons why this was the case. So one was that they saw that they were generally favorable about multiple perspectives, having the insight from both the child and their adult into their preferences may be useful. They thought it might be useful. They also saw a potential role for an adult, predominantly thinking about parents, I think, in terms of aiding clarification and understanding for the child, particularly if the child was of a certain age where they couldn't comprehend things fully themselves. And what was also interesting, I guess, on these initial findings was that the taxpayer argument, so the idea that we should ask, for example, in the UK, the adults have the predominant tax burden, so they essentially fund a public health system, so we should prioritize their preferences in terms of whether they think certain child health states are good or bad. Wasn't really supported. So it was interesting to know, because that is something that is cited quite a lot as a rationale, or has been cited in the literature as a rationale for why we should potentially ask adults to value child health states, even though the adults can't theoretically experience child health states. And then moving on to the perspective issue, what was clear from this first set of qualitative results was that participants were intuitively in favour of an own perspective, or participants, regardless of whether they were adults or adolescents, taking an own perspective when they were asked to put a value or to respond to the evaluation of hypothetical health states. And the main reason for this was because they thought it would be difficult to abstract further. So it was already a complex task, and then to abstract further, to not think about your own preferences, but to think about, for example, the preferences that you may have for a 10-year-old child, was seen as quite a difficult cognitive task. So the majority of people in these focus groups thought it would be simpler to just get to involve adults and children and to get their own perspectives when they were completing the valuation tasks. One final point, really, before we move on, summarize and move on to the next study, is that disclosure was seen as quite positive. So participants in general thought that anyone completing evaluation tasks should be fully informed. So they were generally of the view that they should know that it's child health states. So if it was adults doing the valuation, then they should know it's child health states that they're valuing. And also they should know the potential use of the value sets. So I think the former is probably more often done than the latter. So I'm not sure in valuation studies whether participants are always fully informed of the downstream consequences. So that is to say that the value set may be used in funding or cost effectiveness models, which may be used in funding decisions for health technologies, in this case in children. So ethically and just practically, they were in favour of disclosure for that issue. So to summarise really the findings from study 1, so this was essentially, to my knowledge, the first sort of systematic qualitative study that looked at UK adult public views into who they thought in principle should value child health. The overarching takeaway is that they think that young people should be involved in some form, but there wasn't really, it's not, due to the design of the study and the mixed views, it's not really possible to ascertain exactly at what age they thought, children should be involved versus when they should not. But it was clear that there was general greater support for autonomous involvement when the children got older. There was broad support amongst, at least half of the participants for involving adults and children in the process and not just obtaining preferences from children. And there was that key thing around participants favouring, valuing, thinking about the self rather than thinking about other people when they're conducting the exercise to avoid confusion. And the arguments that were sort of elicited for asking children, so the strongest was that they have the right to have a say, whereas other arguments that came out about asking adults were around life experience. So adults have a wealth of experience around health and other issues and can have that informed perspective about their preferences for living in different health states. And there was also that parental or guardianship role, in the sense that adults and parents in particular already make some important decisions for children. So as this was viewed as an important issue, they saw adults' role extended to valuation as well. So that was a wrap up of the initial qualitative study, and then we're going to move on now to study 2, which is the international Delphi study. So this was conducted with an expert sample. And a Delphi survey is essentially normally a multiple round survey where you try to establish consensus among a group of expert participants. And we targeted an expert sample in child valuation. So we essentially looked at people internationally who'd published work in child health valuation. We also looked at key groups like the Euroqual group and others who may have collections of members that have worked on child health valuation. And then we also wanted to involve not just academics, but people from policy. So we had people that were based at the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK. And also people from the Department of Health and Social Care in the UK. So our policymakers were restricted to the UK because the context of the Delphi survey was about valuing child health in the UK, and we felt that they would have a more intimate knowledge of the UK than international policymakers might have, but we did extend it out to international academics because we thought that they could bring a wider perspective and would have a sufficient understanding of the UK system given their knowledge of health economics and valuation in general. So we went up to 3 rounds of the survey. This was going to be a maximum. As you'll find out, that we actually went to 2 rounds because we decided at the time that further consensus was unlikely to be achieved on some of the remaining issues, and that it was sort of a cost benefit exercise, that there was diminishing returns on the Delphi survey, so we kept it as 2 rounds. We set an a priori consent criterion for what we determine consensus, and this was greater or equal to 75% of agreement amongst Delphi panelists. We also had an approaching consensus criterion, but I'm not going to talk about that today. We're just going to focus on what reached that consensus threshold. So the questions we asked were very much along the similar vein to the qualitative study, but more formalized in a quantitative way on who they think should value child health, what perspective, who they think they should imagine when they're doing so, and also related methodological questions around, for example, some of the ethics involved or how certain value sets should be analysed. And in the Delphi methodology, you essentially, after you completed 1 round, you feed back the results to participants and then ask them similar or follow-up questions to try and move towards greater consensus. So our sample was pretty good for this type of exercise, for a Delphi exercise. We started with 62 experts in the initial first round, and then that reduced, as you'd expect, a little bit to 47 in round 2. So it's not a bad response rate. I think we invited about 100 to start with. So you're looking at, for the initial round, 62%, which is pretty good. About half, well, slightly over half were women. Mean age was again sort of in that middle age bracket. Quite nicely, we had 18 countries represented by the international scope of the academics that were working in the area, but there were, as you'd expect, clusters within UK, the United States, and Australia. You'll see there that the breakdown in terms of we had about 38 academics, 13 who identified as working in industry, and that could include not-for-profit and the charity sector as well. And then we had 11 policymaker representatives, either based at NICE or Department of Health and Social Care in the UK. And the experience level, the self-declared experience level, was quite high on average. So we had a mean 15 years experience working in health economics, and we also had a scale where they self-rated their experience in child health valuation, and the majority, the vast sort of 90-odd% had experience in that area. There was only a very small amount that didn't, and the results do not change if they're removed from the sample. So just to I guess look at some of the key results from this study as well. So you'll begin to see sort of similarities as we go through these studies, which is what we'll focus on when we recap at the end. But there was consensus, so over 75% of Delphi panelists agreed that older adolescents, so this was children aged 16 to 17, and adults aged 18 plus, so that's involving both of them, should be included in a sample valuing child health states aged 8 to 17. There was also agreement over 75% that adolescents aged 15 years old and over could be included if the exercise did not involve trading off life years. So, for example, if it was a DCE that did not involve duration, and then the anchoring was achieved in some other way, that the expert sample thought that it probably okay to go to children as young as 15. And I guess it's worth remembering here that the bar is actually pretty high for consensus. So while you might see a majority view for a particular point, we had to get to 75% above agreement based on prior norms within Delphi studies to actually decide that we've got consensus within this sample. So these are all based on these issues have all reached that high bar of consensus. Children aged equal to or less than 10 years should not be included if we involve trading off life years and thinking about hypothetical age of death. And there was a view that we shouldn't in the UK, for valuing child health, we should focus on recruiting a general population sample and not those who may have experience working with children, for example, which is an argument that's sometimes given in this area, that maybe we should ask parents, or we should ask people that work with children clinically or in an education setting. But these group of experts thought that the best way to go was to look at a general population sample. And then for reaching consensus and who to imagine, so maybe conversely to the first qualitative study, the consensus in the expert sample was that adults aged 18 and over should adopt a form of child perspective. So there was no support for adults adopting an own perspective when valuing child health states, but instead they should adopt some form of child perspective. So there wasn't consensus about what form that should take, whether it was them imagining themselves as a younger child or imagining another younger child, but there was consensus for a child perspective in general. And then the adolescents, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the age range of the health states, 8 to 17, participants thought that if adolescents are involved, then they should adopt an own perspective. They think about their own health. And like in the first qualitative study, participants generally agreed that they should know that it's child health states that they're valuing, so that shouldn't try and mask that from the valuation sample when they're doing the exercise. And then I guess as interesting maybe as the actual issues reaching consensus is areas where there's not that level of consensus amongst the experts that we sampled. And this is what we do with essentially children within a certain age range. So children aged 11 to 15, if we involve trading off life years, I wasn't sure whether they should be included or not. Children aged 7 to 14, when they're not trading off life years, should they be included? There was uncertainty about the questions we asked and resolution in terms of how we should actually produce value sets and analyze them. So if we involve, 16 to 17-year-olds and adults in the samples, should we produce combined value set with everyone's preferences in? Should we produce an adolescent one and an adult one? There wasn't really consensus around that. As I mentioned, there wasn't consensus around which child perspective adults should take when they're valuing child health, who they should think about when they're doing so. And we got quite a lot of uncertainty around the normative arguments. So we asked for whether people agreed with or endorsed certain arguments for different positions. And while we saw, like in the first study, the taxpayer argument getting least support and things like right to have a say get approaching consensus in terms of getting stronger support, there was lots that were kind of middling in terms of whether people thought they had value or not. Okay, so just to summarize this, and we'll go on to our last study. So this again was the first Delphi study of its kind that was looking at consensus amongst a group of experts about who should value child health. There was that sort of consensus that older adolescents should be involved, and the consensus was 16 plus if we're involved in trading off life years and thinking about hypothetical death, or 15 plus if that's not the case and the anchoring's being achieved in another way. A key thing, again, it's not just support for asking kids. So they think that adults do have a role in valuing child health, and that they should adopt some child perspective when they're doing so, whereas older adolescents should think about themselves. This obviously has implications for the practicalities and how you're analysing results, given that you've got two different age ranges taking two different perspectives in the valuation task, but this wasn't resolved in this study. Okay, so we're on to study 3, and then I'll just do my best to wrap everything up. I know this is a lot of evidence all in one go, but there are some common threads that will simplify things. So this was the last study that's recently finished when we looked at quantitative views of members of the UK and Swedish public. So this was an online survey, so it came after the prior two studies that we've just talked about, and the idea here was to essentially ask some of the questions we asked in the focus group in study 1, but to a larger sample of people, and also to essentially look at a comparison between the UK and Sweden. So while we're similar culturally, we've got HTA bodies that take slightly different approaches, so we were interested whether members of the public shared the same views in the two countries about valuing child health. And we, just like we did for study 1, we went to great lengths as much as possible to create those specialized lay-friendly videos at the start of the research and for the survey, and to make sure, essentially with help from expert advisory committees, that they made sense for a lay audience. And we did our best to inform people essentially before they completed the survey. We had a target sample of 1,200 in each country, and we recruited based on age and gender quotas. And the key thing in this research is we actively oversampled at the younger end. And this was, again, for novelty's sake, because we'd not done any research really with younger people yet. So we wanted to make sure we had a good sample of 15 to 17-year-olds, and also a good sample of what we called emerging adults. So that's young adults, 18 to 20. So it isn't a representative sample. It's more of a sample that's oversampled on the younger end. And we do make some crude comparisons by country, but there's further analysis to be done on that. And the countries are quite well matched, but not perfectly matched. So the comparisons are exploratory in nature. So this is the sample. Essentially, the figures on the left are for the UK and the figures on the right are for Sweden. So as you can expect, because we use quota sampling, we had roughly 50% men and women. Our mean age was pretty much matched across the countries and was on the younger side, as I've explained. We had, for the UK, we have ethnicity data, but not for Sweden, because my collaborator in Sweden said it wasn't culturally appropriate or to ask for ethnicity. They don't normally do it, but we do have some minority ethnic representation within that. Less well educated as a sample compared to our study 1, which is refreshing, I suppose. And there were some differences, as you can see, in terms of the numbers in that were either employed or students in training in the UK versus Sweden, and also in level of health. So perhaps through sampling or by chance, the UK sample reported being in better health than Sweden. And we had around a fifth to a quarter that were actually parents in the sample as well. So just top line results from this latest survey then. So the majority of people that responded thought that both children and adults should be involved in valuing child health. So again, similarities to previous work. And a vast majority thought that 16 to 17-year-olds should be asked to value health. And then you'll see in the bullet points underneath that comment that in that statement that this percentage goes down as we reduce the age of children in the survey. So that's logically consistent, is what we'd expect. And you'll see that the majority think that maybe 14 to 15-year-olds should be involved, but it reduces to a minority when we get to 12 to 13. Quite interesting results from this that are unique from this survey, I suppose, is that the 15 to 17-year-olds that we sampled said they wanted to be eligible in principle to do the valuation of child and adolescent health. And most of our sample thought that it was appropriate or acceptable in principle for children of and adolescents of a minimum age to trade off life years. And there was some variability in what that minimum age would be. In terms of who should be imagined, so it was a little bit, I guess the results were a little bit less clear for this issue, but it is slightly more complicated than just who should complete the tasks. But there was a majority that thought adults should imagine a child or adolescent when they completed health state valuation. A majority in Sweden, and the modal response, but not quite reaching a majority in the UK, thought that adolescents should think about themselves when they value child health. And majority of participants said that they thought if they were completing the exercises themselves that they'd give a different response or have different preferences if they were asked to think about a 15-year-old child versus a 10-year-old child, or a 4-year-old child versus a 10-year-old child. So that's obviously qualitative evidence. We found from quantitative evidence that sometimes does, but sometimes doesn't bear out in practice. So I'm going to summarize this, and then we're on to our recap prior to our discussion. So again, first survey that's sort of compared public views in the UK and Sweden. I think it's kind of reassuring, as well as, I guess, interesting, that the views are largely consistent from what we found before. So there is that replicability, that's the thread that's going through this research, which is reassuring. We do have those unique findings from this survey. So the views that the general public think it's okay in principle to ask children of a certain age to trade off life years, that the majority of 15 to 17-year-olds wanted to be involved in principle, and that our comparisons with the UK and Sweden in terms of maybe the percentages would differ, but the majority viewpoint was consistent. And this thing again around taxpayer argument came out independently as being ranked the least important for deciding who values child health. So the last sort of sections now from me. The first one's what's common, essentially. So what I've called triangulating the evidence. What's common across these studies? So what's common is that the viewpoint that we should involve or allow both adults and children, older children, to value child and adolescent health states. And the reasons given typically for this is that children have a right to have a say, but adults have that greater life experience, and they have a sort of parental or guardianship responsibility and make important decisions for children already. There's most support for older adolescents being involved, particularly when trading off life years. It gets more grayer or more ambiguous when 14 to 15-year-olds, when they're not trading off life years. There may be a role for them involved in terms of what people think. But there's less common support across all three studies for including children less than 14 years in valuation. And there's this interesting thread throughout, and I'm only pointing it out because it's been used historically in literature to justify asking adults to value child health, that there's minimal support for this sort of taxpayer argument that whoever funds the healthcare system should have a say, we should use their preferences to weight health states for children as well as adults. There's not that much support amongst the taxpaying public for that. In terms of what's common about which perspective, this adolescents adopting an own perspective, which is perhaps unsurprising, but there is sort of intuitive support for adolescents thinking about themselves, and there's a slight sway out of the 3 studies for adults over 18 to think about a child when they're valuing child and adolescent health. So that was supported in study 2 and 3, but what is used, so what child perspective is used, is unclear. So we know Euroqual, for example, have gone with think about a 10-year-old child, but there's not consensus that that's the right thing to do at the moment. One of the last slides before the conclusion is this area of unresolved issues, which may come up in the discussion. So these are some of the unresolved issues that might not be exhaustive. There's the area of mismatch. So there is a degree of inconsistency in views between experts and the public. So there's a lot of consistency. But for example, people that we survey or speak to think that experienced health states should be the way to go, not hypothetical ones. So we should be sampling people that have some experience of the health state. So we don't do that in the UK. We use hypothetical health states. And there was also that inconsistency from the first focus group where they were in favour of people adopting an own perspective to avoid abstraction. But actually in the latter studies with the experts and in the survey, the view was really that they should be thinking about a child. There's areas with lack of consensus, for example, in the Delphi study. So what type of child perspective should people think about? Should it be a 10-year-old child? Should it be a 14-year-old child? Should it be imagine a child in a particular age range? We're not sure how low we can go in terms of involving children. Most support is at the top end of the age range. All these studies were method agnostic, so we didn't ask them didn't get them to complete a TTO in particular, and then, for example, ask them whether they think a child should do this or not. So that could be explored in further research. However, we do get a consistent result in principle, and in the first study, we did expose people to the idea of a TTO in the video. So we did show them what it sort of looked like, but would the perceived complexity of those tasks alter their views? Maybe. And we don't know essentially how to put all this into practice. So one of the issues is if we say, okay, let's involve older adolescents and adults, how, are our methods good enough to facilitate trading off life years in an older adolescent sample, and what should we do with the data? So should we do a combined sample? Do we want to over-represent or weight adolescents' views relative to adults? There's all those methodological, practical questions that this research doesn't address. Okay, so this is the last slide from me. So conclusions are that there's these 3 studies that we conducted out of Sheffield that all seem to suggest the same thing, which is reassuring, that we should be making efforts to involve older adolescents and adults in valuing child health. That adults should adopt a child perspective of some form, and adolescents should think about themselves when completing the exercise. The minimum age, exactly how we're going to get a cut off on that is up for debate, I suppose, and that views differ. But I think there is support for at least starting to involve 16 to 17-year-olds and maybe 15-year-olds if we're not trading off life years. So I think these studies as a whole are useful potentially for policymakers to adopt potential positions on these methodological issues, and for us as a research community. So the next steps really is to look at how we can put these ideas into practice. And then I just want to acknowledge my collaborators on the studies and people who've been involved at various levels with the research, the funders, obviously, and all people who've taken part in the research. So that's it from me, and I'm very happy to discuss things with you. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much, Philip. Sorry, I'm just trying to switch my video on. Oh, yes, great. Thanks very much, Philip. That was a great presentation. Really, really interesting and perfectly timed as well. So I'm sure there'll be several sort of questions and comments arising from your presentation. If people want to either just raise their hand, preferably raise their hand, or put a comment in the group chat, I'll open it up. Rebecca, please go ahead.
Hi, Phil, thanks so much for the presentation. Um, I just want to share a bit on the perspective that the adults should take. So I did a valuation for the CH90 in Uganda. And what I realized in my pilot, I was trying to find out which perspective would be used. And what we realized was that the adults were not willing to take the child perspective because for them, culturally and maybe religiously, it's just wrong to imagine ill health for a child. So they were just not willing to do that. So eventually, we had to use the adult perspective. And even when we managed to convince them that this is what we are trying to do, when they are trading off, we realized that they were holding on to perfect health when it comes to a child to as long as it will take, even if it's perfect health for 1 year. We think that that is better than taking on trading with an ill health. So that's my experience from the Ugandan culture.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rebecca. It's very interesting. So, um, yeah, so what we'd absolutely recognise, I think, and advocate for is culturally and country specific approaches to potentially generating value sets. And I think your example there from Uganda is an illustration of where potentially a one size fits all approach isn't appropriate. And I think organisations such as Euroqual and others do recognise this and recognize the role that there is in sort of local stakeholder engagement prior to deciding, for example, exactly what normative approach you will take in your valuation. Because it sounds like from your experiences, absolutely that adults could be involved, but they can't essentially take another child perspective in your study because of the cultural difficulties and the problems with the values that arise. So I think in that situation, that would be completely justified, and you could look at potentially a modified approach to valuation that otherwise is relatively consistent with what the evidence suggests, and just takes those slightly different approaches for the reasons that you've articulated. I think that's absolutely fine. It's a very interesting issue, and it is something that obviously is key and comes up quite a lot in terms of why it can be problematic to get adults to value child health. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Philip. Any other comments or questions for Philip? Please just raise your hand if you've got a comment or question, or put something in the group chat. Whilst people are thinking of questions, can I ask a question, Philip? I mean, coming back to this issue of perspective, that the perspective that should be adopted, where there seemed to be a thread that suggested that adolescents should adopt, that are included in the valuation task should adopt an own perspective, whereas adults should adopt a child perspective, at least from 2 of the 3 studies, I think that came through. Is the implication of that that you wouldn't be able to have like a mixed sample of adults and adolescents within your within your evaluation study, because because you'd be asking them to adopt different perspectives in the valuation task, so you wouldn't be adopting sort of a uniform perspective.
Yeah, I mean, Stavros, it's a very interesting question, and is something that I don't think has been worked fully through. So I've seen working paper from the US valuation of the EQ5DY, where they've involved, based on stakeholder, I don't know whether they've referred to our research at all, but based on the stakeholder engagement they did in the US, there was a encouragement for them to involve adolescents in some form, and they included quite an age range of adolescents, I think, from sort of 10, 11 through to 17. And they did the DCE sort of task, and then they anchored with adult responses. So they didn't trade off life years, but they did involve quite a lot of adolescents. And they've basically used these 2 different perspectives, but then generated one value set. So they've just essentially combined the results together, even though the perspectives are different. And they will justify this based on the idea that the stakeholder steer was for like one set of results, essentially. They did not want to see multiple iterations or value sets where, for example, the adolescents are pulled out and we have a different one for adults and blah, blah, blah. But I think conceptually, it's something that we should think about as a community, because then we need to think about what those results mean, given that we have we have different, we have adults and adolescents in that we class as potentially different groups of people, and then we have different perspectives as well, and then we're just merging them all together. So of course you can do that mathematically, but what it actually means is up for debate, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if there's a great answer to that, but it's kind of like, I think it's going to be an ongoing debate and discussion as we move forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the group? Nobody's got any question or comment. Can I ask another question then?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, with study 2 again, with the Delphi panel of experts, I noticed that what seemed to be coming out was the sort of a threshold of 10 years of age, where at which below which children shouldn't be included in any sort of trade-off exercises, and that seemed quite low to me. I was sort of expecting a slightly higher threshold based on. I know there's not much evidence in the literature on like TTO studies, for example, in children and adolescents, but I was quite surprised that the threshold was set so low at 10 years.
Yeah, I think it depends on how we view the results, really, because the consensus, because there's information within the survey, I think, that we could have appraised differently if, for example, we didn't take a Delphi perspective. So the norm, the methodological approach within Delphi is to have this high bar of consensus. So you could have 75% greater than or equal to for agreement or disagreement, to say you've got consensual agreement or disagreement. But then, of course, you can have majority views within that don't quite reach consensus. And the clearest things that were coming out really for the agreement side was older adolescents, really. So the takeaways that we've chose to focus on really is that idea for greater involvement for 16 to 17-year-olds, potentially 15, but it depends what methods you take forward. So we don't really focus too much on the bottom end of things, and where we think, for example, there's consensual disagreement that children under a certain age shouldn't take part. And then within the sort of middle age of childhood and adolescence, it was really a sort of mixed bag in terms of the percent that agreed or disagreed of whether we should or should not involve them. We did do a little bit. We looked at, for example, if policymakers thought differently to academics, but on the whole, I think the results are detailed in the paper, I think, but on the whole, it was relatively consistent. So yeah, my short response would probably be, don't worry too much about the bottom end, but there seems to be consistent evidence at that higher end that we think that at least let these older adolescents to get involved. And yeah, what we'd like to do is look at whether the current approaches for example, the EQVT, the evaluation protocol for adults, works in that upper adolescent range, for example, because it might be that they were developed in adults and they're not quite fit for purpose. They need a bit of modification. Sorry. So yeah, that's where I think we're going to concentrate our efforts. But you're right, there was a sort of middling in the middle, and the deciding exactly where the cutoff should be for definitely not including people was a bit low, maybe. But yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Any final question or comment from any of the other participants? No. Okay. Did Philip or Donna, did you want to finish off by saying anything, or?
I don't know if Donna's
Yeah.
No, I am still here. No,
I just wondered if you wanted to finish up by adding anything, or
no, I think thanks, Phil, for a really interesting talk. It's been great.
yeah. Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here, and yeah, watch this space for more developments in value in child health, I suppose.
Yes.
So,
Yes. Thank you very
great.
much.
Cheers, guys. Okay.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye. Bye.